Can you pray in bed? Because for a lot of Christians, that question shows up when the room is dark, your body is done, and your mind still will not stop. You want to reach for God, but all you have left is a whisper, a thought, maybe just a tired ache in your chest, and then the guilt hits. What if this is not real prayer? What if God listens more when you are focused, disciplined, and strong? But the truth most Christians miss is hidden right there in that exhausted moment. So what does God actually see when all you can offer him is your weakness? You reach the end of the day, and it feels like everything inside you is still running. Your body is tired, but your mind refuses to slow down. Thoughts keep circling things you said, things you didn't say, things you should have done differently, things you're still waiting on. And in the middle of all of that, there's this quiet awareness that you haven't really prayed the way you think you should. You're lying there, staring into the dark, and the idea of getting up, kneeling down, focusing your thoughts, forming the right words, it just feels like too much. Not because you don't care, but because you're drained, emotionally, mentally, even spiritually. So instead, you whisper something. Maybe it's just a sentence. Maybe it's not even clear. Maybe it's just a thought directed upward, almost like a sigh. God, are you there? Or, I don't even know what to say tonight. Or, maybe nothing comes out at all. Just a quiet awareness that you need him, but don't have the energy to express it. And then, almost immediately, something else follows. A subtle weight, a quiet guilt. Because somewhere along the way, you learned maybe, without realizing it, that prayer is supposed to look a certain way, focused, intentional, reverent, maybe even a little structured. You've seen it, you've heard it, you've tried to live up to it. And now, lying in bed, half awake and half exhausted, this moment doesn't feel like it fits that image. So a question forms, not always in words, but in feeling. Does this even count? Is this real prayer, or am I just thinking out loud? And underneath that question, there's something deeper, something more personal. Does God actually hear me like this? Because if you're honest, part of you wonders if God listens more when you're at your best, when you're focused, when you're disciplined, when your faith feels strong and your words sound right. And maybe, without meaning to, you've started to believe that moments like this scattered, unfocused are somehow less valuable, less spiritual, less heard. But here's the tension that you can't quite resolve. If God is truly close, if he really cares, if he sees everything happening inside you, then why would this moment feel so uncertain? Why would something as simple as turning to him feel like it might not be enough? You're not rejecting God. You're not ignoring him. If anything, you're reaching for him in the only way you can right now. And still, there's that lingering doubt, that quiet voice that says, this isn't how it's supposed to be. And maybe that's what makes this so heavy, because it's not just about where you are physically. It's not about being in bed instead of on your knees. It's about the fear that something in you isn't measuring up, that your way of approaching God in this moment falls short of what he expects. So you hesitate. Even in your own thoughts, you start wondering if you should try harder, focus more, say more, do something different. But at the same time, you know you don't have much left to give tonight. You've already poured yourself out into everything else. And now you're here, quiet, tired, a little overwhelmed, still needing God, but unsure if you're reaching him the right way. And maybe you've never said it out loud, but it's there. What if God only responds to a certain kind of prayer? What if sincerity isn't enough? What if posture, effort, and intensity matter more than I thought? Because if that's true, then what does that mean for moments like this? Moments when your faith feels more like a flicker than a fire. Moments when your thoughts are messy, your emotions are heavy, and your words don't come easily. Moments when all you can offer is presence, not performance. And this is where something inside you begins to wrestle. Because part of you knows that God is not distant. You've heard it, maybe even believed it at times. That he is near, that he sees, that he understands, that he listens. But another part of you has slowly absorbed a different message. That how you come to God determines how he responds. That there is a better way to be heard. And now, lying in the quiet, those two ideas are colliding. One says, God is close. no matter what. The other whispers, "But this might not be enough." So which one is true? Because if you get this wrong, it changes everything. It changes how you approach God tomorrow. It changes how you pray in your hardest moments. It changes whether you run toward Him or hesitate, waiting until you feel more ready, more worthy, more spiritual. And maybe that's the real issue here. Not the bed, not the posture, not even the words, but the belief you've been carrying without fully realizing it, the belief that God's attention must be earned, even in prayer. And if that belief is wrong, then it means something important has been misunderstood. Something that might be quietly shaping your relationship with God in ways you didn't expect. So the question isn't just, can you pray in bed? The real question is deeper than that. What actually makes a prayer reach God? And if the answer isn't what you've assumed, then everything about the way you approach Him might begin to change. What you're feeling in that quiet moment isn't random. It didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was shaped slowly, subtly, by something you may have never questioned. Somewhere along your journey, you learned that prayer has a certain look. Not necessarily in words someone forced on you, but in patterns you observed. The way others prayed, the way it was taught, the way it was modeled. Prayer became something structured, intentional, focused, something that required your full attention, your best effort, your clearest thoughts. And none of that is wrong in itself. But here's where something began to shift without you noticing. Over time, what started as a helpful structure quietly became an expectation, and that expectation slowly turned into pressure. Because now, when your reality doesn't match that image, when you're tired, distracted, emotionally worn, you don't just feel weak. You feel like you're doing it wrong. And that's the misunderstanding that sits underneath your question. It's not really about the bed. It's about the belief that God responds more to how your prayer looks than to what your heart is actually doing. Think about that for a moment. If you believe that, even slightly, it changes the way you approach God. You begin to filter your connection with Him through performance. You start measuring your own sincerity based on how focused you feel, how many words you use, how emotionally intense your prayer is. And when those things are missing, you assume something is lacking. But here's the quiet truth. Most people never stop to examine. You didn't learn that from God. You learned that from interpretation, from observation, from culture, from trying to do things right. And again, the intention behind it may have been good. Discipline matters. Intentional time with God matters. There is value in setting aside space to pray deeply and without distraction. But the problem begins when you take something that is helpful and turn it into something that defines whether God listens. Because now, without realizing it, you've created a condition, a silent rule that says, if I don't approach God this way, then maybe He won't respond the same way. And that's where fear quietly enters. Not loud fear, not obvious fear, but a subtle hesitation, a second guessing, a moment where you hold back instead of leaning in. And this is where the internal conflict deepens. Because on one hand, you believe God is loving, present, attentive. But on the other hand, you act as if access to Him depends on your condition, your focus, your effort, your ability to get it right. So when you're lying there at night, exhausted, your thoughts scattered, your emotions heavy, you don't just feel tired, you feel disqualified. And maybe you've never used that word, but it shows up in how you hesitate, in how you wonder if it's enough, in how you question whether you should even try, if you can't do it properly. But let's pause here for a second and look at something honestly. If God only responded to perfect conditions, how often would anyone truly reach Him? Because real life doesn't always give you calm, focused, uninterrupted moments. Real life is messy. It's exhausting. It's filled with mental noise, emotional weight, and days that leave you with almost nothing left. So if prayer only works when everything is aligned, then what happens in all the moments when it's not? Does God step back? Does He wait for you to improve your posture, your clarity, your energy? Or is something else true that you haven't fully seen yet? This is where a small but powerful realization begins to form. Maybe the issue isn't that your prayer is too weak. Maybe the issue is that your definition of prayer has been too narrow. Because if prayer is only valid when it looks a certain way, Then, of course, moments like this will feel uncertain. But if prayer is something deeper, something less about performance, and more about connection, then what you're redoing right now might not be lacking at all. It might actually be more real than you think. Still, there's tension here, because part of you resists that idea. You might be thinking, but shouldn't I give God my best? Shouldn't I be intentional? Shouldn't I try harder? And those questions matter. But what if your best doesn't always look like strength? What if sometimes your best is simply showing up, even when you're tired? What if effort is not measured by how impressive your prayer sounds, but by the fact that you're still turning toward God at all? This is where things begin to shift, even if just slightly. Because now, the question is no longer just about whether you can pray in bed, it becomes something deeper. What is God actually looking at when you pray? Is He evaluating your posture or your heart? Is He measuring your words or your dependence? Is He waiting for you to reach a certain level, or is He already present, even in your lowest moments? And if the answer challenges what you've assumed, then it means something important is about to change. Because the moment you realize that God is not responding to a performance, you start to approach Him differently. But we're not there yet. There's still something you need to see. Because even if you begin to question this misunderstanding, there's another layer underneath it, a deeper truth about who God is in these moments. And until you see that clearly, this tension will keep coming back, especially on nights like this. There's a reason this tension keeps coming back, especially in your quietest moments. It's because deep down, you're not just questioning your prayer, you're questioning where God is in that moment. Not out loud, not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle, almost unspoken thought. If I don't feel focused, if I don't feel connected, if I don't feel spiritual, is God still as close as I think He is? Because closeness to you often feels tied to awareness, and when your awareness is clouded by exhaustion, distraction, or emotional weight, it can feel like the connection itself has weakened. But here's where something important begins to shift. God's presence is not dependent on your perception. That means whether you feel focused or scattered, clear or confused, strong or barely holding on, His newness does not change. And that challenges something you may have quietly assumed. Because if God is always near, not just in your best moments, but in your most tired ones, then prayer is not about reaching a distant God. It's about responding to a God who is already there. Let that settle for a second. You're not trying to get God's attention from across a distance. You're not trying to impress Him into listening. You're not trying to unlock access through effort. You are turning towards someone who has never stepped away. And that changes the entire foundation of what prayer is. Because now, prayer is not a performance you offer upward. It becomes an awareness. You step in, a quiet turning of your heart toward the presence that has been with you the whole time. And suddenly, the setting matters less. The posture matters less. Even the structure begins to take a different place. Because if God is not far, then you don't need perfect conditions to reach Him. You only need a heart that turns. This is why the idea of praying at all times exists not as pressure, but as invitation. Not as a command to constantly speak, but as a reminder that connection with God is not limited to specific moments or environments. It's continuous, and yet, this is where another misunderstanding often appears. Because when you hear pray at all times, it can feel unrealistic. You think, how can I always be praying? I have responsibilities, distractions, a busy mind. But maybe always doesn't mean what you think it means. Maybe it doesn't mean constant words. Maybe it means constant openness. A heart that remains turned toward God, even when words are few. Even when thoughts are scattered, even when all you can offer is awareness. And if that's true, then what happens in those quiet moments in bed? When you're not forming perfect sentences, when your thoughts drift in and out, when your emotions feel heavier than your clarity. Could it be that those moments are not interruptions to prayer, but a different form of it? Because think about this. If God truly sees everything happening inside you, every thought, every emotion, every unspoken concern, then your awareness of Him in that moment is already a form of connection. Even if it feels weak, even if it feels incomplete, even if it doesn't look like what you've always called prayer. And this is where a quiet relief begins to emerge. Because now, you don't have to force something artificial just to feel like you're doing it right. You don't have to push yourself into a version of prayer that doesn't match your reality in that moment. You can simply be present. Present with your thoughts. Present with your emotions. Present with God. And that presence, that simple turning, carries more meaning than you realize. But here's where the tension hasn't fully disappeared yet. Because even if you begin to accept that God is near, even if you start to see prayer as something more relational than structured, there's still a question that lingers. What about the quality of your prayer? Doesn't God care about your focus, your intention, your effort? Is there a difference between a distracted thought and a sincere prayer? Because if prayer becomes too undefined, too open, it can feel like it loses its depth. And that's a valid concern. You don't want something meaningless. You don't want to reduce prayer to casual thinking. You want it to matter. You want it to be real. So where is the balance? If God is always near and prayer is always possible, then what actually makes a moment of connection meaningful? Is it still about how much you say, how deeply you feel, how focused you are? Or is there something else, something quieter, but far more important, that defines what prayer really is? Because until you understand that, you'll keep drifting between two extremes, either trying to perform your way into connection or wondering if what you're doing is enough. And somewhere between those two, there is a truth that brings clarity, a truth that doesn't remove depth from prayer, but actually gives it meaning in every moment of end, the ones that feel the weakest. And once you see that clearly, you won't just ask if you can pray in bed anymore. You'll start to realize that some of your most honest moments with God may have been there all along. There's still something inside you that hesitates, even after realizing that God is near. Even after beginning to understand that prayer is not about reaching Him from a distance. There's a quiet resistance that hasn't fully let go, because part of you still believes that weakness changes how God receives you. You may not say it directly, but it shows up in how you evaluate your own moments with Him. When you feel strong, focused, clear, you feel confident. You feel like your prayer is real, meaningful, effective. But when you feel tired, distracted, emotionally drained, something shifts. You start to question it. You start to wonder if it matters less. And that reveals something important. You've been associating spiritual value with personal strength, as if the more put together you are, the more valid your connection with God becomes. But what if that's completely backwards? What if the moments you've been quietly dismissing are actually the ones that matter most? Because think about what's really happening when you're lying there at night, exhausted. You're not performing. You're not trying to sound right. You're not shaping your words to fit an expectation. If anything, all of that has fallen away. What's left is something raw, something unfiltered, something honest. And honesty has always been at the center of real connection with God. Not polished words, not perfect focus, but truth. The kind of truth that doesn't try to impress, it just shows up. And this is where a deeper shift begins to take place. Because now, instead of asking, "Is this good enough?" you begin to see a different question forming. What if this is exactly the kind of moment God welcomes? Not because it's ideal, but because it's real. Because when your strength is gone, your dependence becomes clearer. You're no longer relying on your ability to do it, right? You're simply aware that you need Him. And that awareness, that quiet, unfiltered need, is closer to the heart of faith than you may realize. But this is where another internal tension can rise. Because you might think, but shouldn't I grow? Shouldn't I become more disciplined, more focused in prayer? And the answer is, yes, growth matters. But growth in your relationship with God is not about replacing weakness with strength. It's about learning to bring both to Him without hesitation. Because if you only come to God when you feel strong, then your connection is built on conditions. But if you learn to come to Him when you feel weak, then your connection is built on trust. And trust doesn't require perfection. It requires honesty. This is why weakness is not a barrier in your spiritual life. It's often the doorway. But that idea can feel uncomfortable because everything in you has been trained to avoid weakness, to overcome it, to fix it. So bringing it into your relationship with God can feel wrong, like you should clean it up first, like you should wait until you're more focused, more clear, more ready. But if you always wait until you feel ready, how many real moments will you miss? How many opportunities for honest connection will pass by simply because they didn't look spiritual enough? And here's something that might shift your perspective even further. What if God is not waiting for your strongest moments to connect with you, but is especially attentive in your weakest ones? Not because He values weakness itself, but because those are the moments when you are most aware of your need for Him. And that awareness is where real relationship begins. Not in control, not in perfection, but in dependence. So when you're lying there, tired, your thoughts scattered, your emotions heavy, and all you can do is turn your attention toward God, even briefly, that moment is not lacking. It's revealing. It reveals that, even without strength, you're still reaching. Even without clarity, you're still aware. Even without the right words, you're still turning toward Him. And that turning matters more than you think. But the tension hasn't fully resolved yet, because even if you begin to accept that weakness is not disqualifying, there's still something in you that wants to measure, to understand what makes a prayer real, to define what gives it weight. Because you don't just want to feel better about your moments with God, you want to know that they are meaningful, that they matter, that they are truly being received. So the question deepens once again. If it's not about strength, if it's not about perfect focus, if it's not about performance, then what is God actually looking at when you pray? What is it that gives your quiet, tired, imperfect moments real spiritual value? Because once you understand that clearly, you won't just feel less guilty. You'll start to experience something you may not have felt in a long time: freedom. At this point, something inside you is starting to loosen. The pressure to perform, the quiet fear of not doing it right, the subtle belief that your connection with God depends on your strength, that's all being challenged. But there's still one question that hasn't fully settled in your heart. What actually gives your prayer value? Because even if you accept that God is near, even if you begin to believe that weakness doesn't disqualify you, there's still a part of you that wants to understand what makes a moment with God real. Not just acceptable, meaningful. Because deep down, you don't just want to get by spiritually, you want your relationship with God to be genuine, alive, true. So if it's not about posture, not about length, not about perfect focus, then what is it? Here's where the answer becomes both simple and deeply challenging. What gives your prayer value is not how it appears. It's whether your heart is actually turning toward God. That's it. Not how long you stay there. Not how clearly you speak. Not how emotionally intense the moment feels. But whether, in that moment, you are directing your attention, your need, your awareness toward Him. And that changes everything. Because now, prayer is no longer something you measure by external standards. It becomes something defined by internal direction. Where is your heart leaning? Where is your trust moving? Where are your thoughts going when everything else quiets down? Because you can say many words without truly turning toward God, and you can say almost nothing and be completely present with Him. And if that's true, then suddenly those quiet moments in bed take on a completely different meaning. When your mind is tired, when your emotions are heavy, when your words are few or even absent, but something in you still looks toward God even briefly, that moment carries weight. Not because it's impressive, but because it's sincere. And sincerity has a kind of depth that performance can never reach. But this is where something even more subtle begins to surface. Because you might still wonder, but what about distraction? What about when my thoughts wander? What about when I start trying to pray, and within seconds, my mind is somewhere else? And that's real. Because your mind doesn't suddenly become quiet just because you want to connect with God. Especially at the end of the day, when everything you've carried is still moving inside you. So does distraction cancel out sincerity? Does a wandering mind make your prayer less real? Or is something else happening in those moments? Think about this carefully. If every time your mind drifts, you gently bring it back toward God, what are you actually doing? You're turning again and again. Not perfectly, not consistently, but intentionally. And that repeated turning, that quiet returning of your attention is itself an act of prayer, even if it feels small, even if it feels messy. Because what God sees is not just where your mind goes, but where you keep bringing it back, and that reveals something deeper than focus. It reveals desire. It reveals that despite distraction, despite fatigue, despite everything pulling your thoughts in different directions, you are still choosing Him, even if it's imperfect, even if it's quiet, even if it's barely noticeable. And that matters more than you think, because now, prayer is no longer about maintaining a perfect moment. It's about returning over and over again. It's about choosing connection, even when it's not easy, even when it's not clear, even when it doesn't feel strong. And suddenly, the pressure begins to fade. You don't have to hold everything together. You don't have to create the perfect environment in your mind. You don't have to force yourself into a version of prayer that feels unnatural in that moment. You can simply come as you are, tired, distracted, unfocused, and still turn toward God. But here's where the transformation deepens. Because when you stop measuring your prayer by performance, you start to notice something you may have missed before. God has been present in more moments than you realized. In the quiet thoughts you dismissed. In the brief awareness you didn't count. In the simple turning of your heart that didn't feel spiritual enough. He was there, not waiting for you to improve the moment, but meeting you in it. And this realization begins to shift how you see everything. Because now, instead of asking, was that enough? You start to recognize that was real. Even if it was small, even if it was imperfect, even if it didn't match your expectations, but we're not fully at peace yet. Because there's still one final shift that needs to happen. One truth that brings all of this together. Because it's one thing to understand that God accepts your sincere, imperfect prayers, but it's another thing to truly rest in that, to stop questioning, to stop second-guessing, to stop feeling like you need to improve the moment before it counts. And that shift happens when you realize something deeper about God Himself. Not just what He accepts, but how He actually responds to you, especially in moments like this. Now, everything begins to come together, not just as an idea, but as something you can actually rest in. Because up until now, you've been slowly letting go of something, this quiet belief that prayer has to look a certain way, feel a certain way, sound a certain way to be received by God. You've started to see that He is near, that your weakness is not a barrier, that your sincerity matters more than your structure. But there's still one final shift that changes everything from understanding to peace. And it's this: God is not passively accepting your prayer, He is actively receiving you. That's different, because acceptance can feel distant, neutral, like something that is allowed, but not necessarily desired. But receiving is personal, intentional, close. It means that when you turn toward God, even in the smallest, weakest, quietest way, you are not being evaluated. You are being welcomed. And that challenges one of the deepest fears you've been carrying without realizing it. The fear that maybe God is distant in your imperfect moments. The fear that maybe He's more attentive when you're focused and less engaged when you're tired. But what if the opposite is closer to the truth? What if God is not leaning away in your weakest moments, but leaning in? Not because your weakness impresses Him, but because your need draws you closer to what has always been true. You'll depend on Him, and that's where real relationship exists. Not in the moments where you feel in control, but in the moments where you quietly realize you're not. Think about what happens when you stop trying to fix the moment, when you stop trying to force clarity, when you stop measuring whether your prayer is good enough, and you simply become aware God is here, not far, not waiting, not distant. Here, in the silence, in the tiredness, in the thoughts that don't fully settle, in the quiet turning of your heart, that awareness changes everything. Because now, instead of trying to reach God, you begin to rest with Him. And that's the shift most people miss. Prayer is not always about speaking. Sometimes it's about staying, remaining, being present with God, even when nothing feels particularly spiritual, even when your mind is slow, even when your emotions are unclear, even when your words don't come. Because the value of that moment is not created by what you produce. It's rooted in who He is, and who He is has not changed. He is still attentive, still present, still aware of every thought you haven't fully formed, still close, even when you don't feel it clearly. And this is where something quietly powerful begins to happen. Because when you truly believe that God is already near, you stop trying to create the perfect moment. You start recognizing the one He already in. And suddenly, the bed is no longer a place of doubt. It becomes a place of awareness, a place where you can let go of the day, not by performing, but by surrendering, not by saying everything perfectly, but by simply being with Him. And here's where the final question dissolves, because you were asking, can I pray in bed? But now, that question starts to feel unnecessary, because you're no longer thinking in terms of allowed or not allowed. You're seeing something deeper. There is no place where God is absent. There is no moment where turning toward Him becomes invalid. There is no condition where sincerity stops mattering. So the real question is no longer about where you are, but about whether you are aware of Him there, and if you are even faintly, even imperfectly, then you are already in a moment of connection. But this leads to one final realization, because understanding this is one thing, living in it is another. What would change in your life if you stopped questioning whether your quiet, tired moments with God count and started trusting that He is already meeting you there? Now you can finally rest. Not because everything in your life is resolved, not because your thoughts suddenly became quiet, not because you found the perfect way to pray, but because something deeper has settled inside you. The question that once carried weight, does this count, no longer holds the same power, because you've seen what was underneath it. You've seen that it was never really about the bed, or the posture, or the structure of your prayer. It was about how you thought. God saw you in those moments. And now, that view has changed. You're no longer approaching God as if you need to earn His attention. You're no longer measuring your worth in His presence by how strong, focused, or composed you feel. You're no longer hesitating in your weakest moments, wondering if they are enough. Because now you understand something that brings quiet clarity. God has never been waiting for a better version of you to listen. He has always been attentive to the real you, the tired you, the distracted you, the version of you that doesn't have the right words, the version of you that can only offer a thought, a sigh, or even just awareness. And that changes how you see everything. Because now, when you find yourself lying in bed at the end of the day, when your body is heavy and your mind is still trying to process everything, when your prayer doesn't look structured or complete, you no longer pull back. You don't question it the same way. You don't feel that quiet guilt creeping in. Instead, you rest in it. Not because the moment is perfect, but because you know God is present in it. And slowly, something begins to shift in how you relate to Him. Prayer becomes less about trying and more about trusting. Less about saying everything right and more about being real. Less about reaching and more about resting. And this is where peace begins to replace pressure, because you're no longer carrying the weight of trying to create a spiritual moment. You're simply living in one, even in the quiet, even in the ordinary, even in the moments that once felt too small to matter. And here's what's beautiful about that. When you stop performing, you start connecting, not in a forced way, not in a structured way, but in a way that feels natural, steady, and real. Because now, when your thoughts drift, you gently return. When your words don't come, you remain present. When your emotions feel heavy, you don't hide them. You bring them. And over Chimi, something deeper begins to grow. Not a louder faith, but a more grounded one. Not a more impressive prayer life, but a more